One thing I wanted to talk about, and I was going to open up by saying that this is something that was not talked about very much today, until John sort of alluded to it, is I think something which is actually at the heart of the TTIP agreement, and that's the redefinition of all manner of public policy and regulation as a non-tariff barrier to trade, as something to be eliminated, something to be gotten rid of in the interests of better, which in this case means less regulation, because regulation is an unnecessary cost to business. And actually what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how that's being done in practice, and it's something that actually gets very little, or relatively little attention, because a lot of TTIP's getting a lot more attention than other trade agreements, or relatively little attention in the TTIP debate, particularly in this country, which tends to focus on more high-profile issues like the NHS and ISDS, which is not to suggest that these issues aren't important, but I think they miss what is, for me, and as we argue in the book, also for Ferdy, at the heart of the agreement. And that's a set of cross-cutting provisions on regulation, and they include both regulatory cooperation, which I think John talked about, but also something called, this is probably going to put you to sleep, particularly after lunch, good regulatory practices or regulatory coherence. You might think, oh, well, good regulatory practices, that sounds lovely, it's phrased in a nice euphemistic way. But particularly that element, because this is an element that the United States is particularly keen on, and the European Union is not objecting to, as it's implementing these sorts of measures anyway, is particularly key, in addition to the regulatory cooperation. So let me start off by talking a little bit about that, and then I can talk about what to do about these things. So good regulatory practices, you might ask yourself, what does that mean? So in the context of TTIP, and we have to work largely on the basis of either the TTIP leaks or before that the EU's publicly available proposals for good regulatory practices, are a series of measures that are intended to make the regulatory process, in the words of the Commission and its and business advocates, more transparent and more accountable, and more attuned to evaluating the proper sort of impact of regulation. Right? You might think, oh, that's all great, right? We all want better regulation to protect us from social, environmental, public health risks, to name but a few issues that we face. But of course, it isn't about improving the level of protection. It's about something else. So, for example, transparency in this context means that the Commission wants to commit itself to early information on regulatory acts, much earlier in the regulatory process than it has done in the past. So this is also part of the better regulation package, but it's also putting allusions or references to this in the TTIP text. And of course, giving early information, the problem with that is that it gives an opportunity for stakeholders to provide input. And this is, of course, the second element, accountability, which in this context, of course, means that stakeholders should be given an opportunity to provide feedback. Now, stakeholders are a very bland word, and it means basically anyone who has an interest in a particular issue. And of course, that includes NGOs and civil society groups, but those who are more well-resourced tend to be big business groups, and they're the ones that the Commission is particularly receptive to, particularly in the context of a set of provisions on good regulatory practices, which are all about, or phrased in such a way that they give greater emphasis to this idea that regulation is something that needs to be minimized in the interest of promoting trade and investment. We come to the final element of good regulatory practices, and this is a series of commitments in the EU draft text, and something also the US is pushing forward for conducting more rigorous impact assessments of regulations and taking those into account, those impact assessments, formally in decision making. It doesn't mean those impact assessments deliver a binding outcome. It doesn't mean that none of these things are binding in a sense. They're all elements of soft law. But what it does is it already starts shaping the agenda shaping process in such a way that it makes it much more difficult for regulators, public policy makers, to take actions that may disadvantage firms because they impose an extra cost on them. And this is, I think, the heart of the matter. In a sense, it's really deregulation via the back door. The Commission can say, possibly with some chutzpah, but still not directly lying, that it is not directly undermining the authority of Parliament, because in theory, it's not changing the legal authority of Parliament to decide over regulation. But of course, if Parliament, particularly the European Parliament, which doesn't have a right of initiative in this context, is only presented with proposals that are watered down or what have you, then you've got an issue. The agenda setting context is important. And essentially what these measures are said to be doing is introducing is said to be introducing paralysis by analysis, right? The more analysis, the more opportunities you provide for feedback, the more you're throwing spanners essentially in the work of regulating the public interest. And what's interesting here, and I'm glad John mentioned this, is the link between this and two agendas. One is the EU's better regulation agenda, so a number of these proposals are already in some form part of a package of better regulation measures that is currently still awaiting approval by the European Parliament, but has been approved by presented by the Commission, but already approved by Member States. And it also is moving towards the US system of regulation by the US federal agencies, which is called notice and comment, which has somewhat more onerous requirements than the EU system. For impact assessment, for transparency, and for consultation with stakeholders, and has been criticized for really watering down a number of regulations put forward by US regulatory authorities. Okay, so that's regulatory coherence, and of course this is something that gets lost, I think, a little bit, even when we talk about regulatory cooperation. And the crucial thing to not forget about this is that it applies to all regulations across the board, right? This is about a set of processes that would apply across the board. It doesn't matter whether there's a sectoral annex on a particular regulatory measure or not. This is about regulation as a whole. It's about shaping the context in which regulation occurs. The second set of provisions is sort of a chapter on regulatory cooperation, which the EU is somewhat keener on than the United States. And this is about formalizing regulatory exchange between the US and the EU, and in a sense giving the other party more opportunities to comment on legislation even in the preparatory phase. And the effect is similar to the good regulatory practices in that this introduces an element of regulatory chill into the process. Because the US has in the past, for example, been very adamantly opposed to EU regulation on GMOs, on chemicals. I remember reading a book on which talked about the REACH regulation on chemicals, and apparently the US Embassy sent a letter to each MEP the day before the vote, with fairly threatening languages on REACH, and it was still passed. But these are all dynamics that are at play here. And I suppose I shouldn't just say this is about the US influencing EU regulations. It's also about the EU influencing US regulations, including at the state level that it doesn't apply. Right? There's a whole host of issues related to that, and I think the interesting thing to note is that there have already been instances of US bringing pressure to bear during the conduct of these trade negotiations, and the Canadian government in the context of CETA, which has, I think, had an influence on EU regulations and regulatory proposals. So one example is the case of the Fuel Quality Directive, which was going to be proposed by the Commission back in 2011, if I'm not mistaken. And initially the proposal had a provision, it was going to include oil from the tar sands as a dirty fuel with a high sort of CO2 value, of course, and that would have had consequences for Canadian oil. It would have made it very difficult for the Canadians to export that oil to the European Union. But following quite a bit of intensive lobbying from the Canadian, but also the US government, in the end the Commission dropped that provision on the Fuel Quality Directive. And the second example, which is a bit more recent, is the case of the Pesticides Directive, which the Commission shelved plans to regulate endocrine disrupting chemicals and pesticides, following a lot of pressure from the US Trade Representative's office, and there's a sort of email trail here. Of course, it's often very difficult to document these cases. I mean, these are sort of two of the cases that have come up. I think the fact of the matter is that the direction of travel is very clear with these measures. And they're very subtle in some ways, but at the same time very, very problematic because they are so often all-encompassing, and they're often missed because they're a bit sort of maybe sleep-inducing. I don't know. You're not falling asleep yet, so I have some hope. On regulatory cooperation, what I would say is the Commission has reduced the scope of this chapter supposedly by saying that it would only apply to sectors where there's already an annex in the negotiations. But there is a possibility to, if both parties agree, extend regulatory cooperation to sectors where both have a mutual agreement. So it's a bit more open-ended than the Commission sometimes lets on. So, what to do about it, right? And maybe I'm baiting John here, but one of the things I think John and we agree on a lot of things, but this is one area where we disagree. I think one thing not to do about it is to think that Brexit is the solution to the ails of TTIP, and that's because precisely for the reasons that I've given just now. For one, Britain, despite what Schäuble has been saying today, is likely, I think, to have some sort of arrangement whereby it has access to the single market. And that, of course, if we look at the precedent, would imply having to sacrifice policy autonomy and have to accept EU regulations and rules in areas of the single market where Britain is participating, right? As Norway does, as Switzerland does. And so, this last section, so perfect. And so the point is, even if Britain steps out of TTIP, any sort of TTIP that was agreed subsequently between the European Union and, well, the remainder of the European Union and the United States would still have a bearing on, the regulatory measures that Britain would have to adopt, indirectly, and without a say in it, of course. Secondly, if you look at the Leave campaign and you look at the sort of people in charge at Westminster, and more generally, you look at the sort of balance of opinion on these issues, I think it's likely to think that the current UK government and the subsequent UK governments would pursue a free trade agreement with the United States, and that is likely to be far worse and far more problematic than the sort of TTIP that's being contemplated. Which is not to say that TTIP isn't problematic, but you would be left with an even worse, potentially, ISDS system. You would be left with a potentially even more deregulatory agreement. And so, and you would be essentially left without the countervailing pressures that exist elsewhere in the European Union against those elements of TTIP. You were just saying that there isn't a German-style debate on TTIP in Britain. It's precisely that German-style debate through membership of the European Union that, in a sense, the British public is able to draw on in limiting the effects of the agreement. So what is the solution to fighting TTIP? I think, as I sort of alluded to, and I think Paul alluded to the importance of having more civil society mobilization on this issue. I think that's crucial. And I think, there's already been a few successes that have been notched up on this front. One, particularly in the regulatory area. So it's not to say that, enough has been done. I think much more remains to be done. But for example, initially the Commission wanted to have a provision in TTIP whereby the agreement, its sectoral annexes on regulation could be amended without going through domestic ratification procedures, right? So this is, that is directly undermining the power of Parliament. And that was dropped because there was a lot of civil society pressure, and that pressure put pressure on member states who subsequently said, hold on a second, this is a bit, we're going a bit too far. I guess it's also an indication of the direction of travel for the Commission. But I think had there not been any civil society protests, and I think within Britain on its own, I think there wouldn't have been enough civil society protests to bring this about. So, I think Varoufakis is right insofar as you have to come together and have to fight these sort of neoliberal aspects of European integration together. It's much more effective.